Hello, I'm Stephen Ellis from the University of Sheffield. In this talk, I'd like to give you a practical guide to evaluation in complex settings. I'd like to do this by showing you a pragmatic approach to theory-driven evaluation. So this course was designed as part of the Master's module in Public Health at the University of Sheffield by myself and colleague Nazreen Nazar. Then it was further developed through some short courses and a one-day workshop for public health practitioners, which was developed with the assistance of Susan Hampshire and Sarah Solway. So what we're going to do, first of all I'm going to give an introduction about theory-driven evaluation, what it is and why it's important in this field. Secondly, the talk that follows that is going to be in three parts. First of all, we're going to try and understand the scope and focus of an evaluation. Then we're going to look at developing program theory and then moving on to consider the usefulness of evaluations. We're going to be doing this through a number of exercises and reflections. You can watch the film through, pause it when we get to the exercises, or go back afterwards. But throughout I'd like you to think of examples about applying the principles that are being demonstrated. So just very briefly, these are the three key principles that we're going to be looking at in the main body of the talk. So establishing the area of investigation, developing an initial program theory, and then considering the usefulness. So theory-driven approaches for public health evaluation. I'd just like to briefly give you a quick overview of theory-driven approaches and why they're important. So what is theory-driven evaluation? It's fundamentally an overall approach for considering the design and implementation of evaluation. It can incorporate a wide range of methods, and it's particularly useful for complex situations and those that rely on behaviour change. It's useful for demonstrating linkages between activities and outcomes, and also for describing reasons for different outcome patterns. Development of theory-driven approaches has largely come about through observing limitations with traditional approaches to evaluation. So traditionally these have tended to fall into two camps. First of all, we have outcomes evaluation, which is looking at, does it work, does a program work, does an intervention work? And secondly, evaluation of processes or activities, so asking the question, is the implementation going as planned? Outcome evaluations tend to treat participants as all acting the same, assuming that context can be controlled or ignoring the context altogether, and rely on linear thinking from an activity or an intervention leading straight to an outcome. So evaluation of processes or activities, it can be rather descriptive rather than analytical, and they focus on predefined activities rather than uncovering practice in its context. They don't allow really for changing context or iterative learning throughout the program. So these two approaches give us a very limited understanding to inform future decisions, and they lead to what's been termed the black box problem. So you can see from the slide that process evaluation looks at the intervention and understanding the intervention, whether it's achieved its aims. Outcome evaluation tends to understand the intervention to some extent, but is focused really on the outcomes. But in between the intervention and the outcomes, there are a lot of implicit assumptions, which we call the black box. So to address the black box problem, theory-driven evaluation illuminates the box in what's called sometimes a white box evaluation. So the program theory draws together information from the complex intervention. It draws together an understanding of the variability of the context. It looks at a whole range of outcome patterns, and importantly, it looks at a range of mechanisms that are assumed to deliver the outcomes from the implementation. And then we get this whole program theory that understands the processes within. So in this first section, I'd like you to think about understanding your evaluation. It's a very important first part of the process of designing an evaluation. I'd like you to think about, in terms of stage of the area that you're looking at, how far advanced is the program or the implementation, looking at the focus, the scope, and the end purpose. So I'd like you to start to think about an area or a topic that you're interested in evaluating, so we can use that as we go through as an example. So our first exercise is understanding your evaluation, I'd like you to consider the stage, the focus, scope, boundaries, and end purpose. And it might be useful here to think about the wishes of the primary end users of evaluation. What are your outputs of your evaluation going to be? Who's going to be using them, and what purposes are they going to be using them for? So you can pause here if you like and take a moment to consider your example in these terms. In terms of the stage element of an evaluation, we need to look at how mature the program or the implementation is that you're looking at evaluating. So in some circumstances you might want to look at pre-implementation, which is looking at the context and what the potential changes could bring about within that context. You could look at an evaluability assessment, so how evaluable is the program. You could look at a formative evaluation, which is understanding how it's developing, or a summative evaluation to see what the final outcomes are. Also, transitional evaluations can be very important for when a program is moving from one state to another. But importantly, for complex evaluations, often recommended is an ongoing evaluation and monitoring process to understand how the program is developing and changing as its context changes around it. So you can see here that an evaluation is largely defined in some respects by the maturity of the program being evaluated, and also the priorities of the end users of the evaluation. So in terms of focus, there can be many different reasons for undertaking an evaluation. These can be to understand the design of the program, to look at the processes and the implementation and delivery of a program. You could be looking at various outcome patterns, the efficiency of a program, looking at impacts further down the line, or the effectiveness of achieving a set criteria. And as well as these, there are many different purposes for an evaluation. An evaluation might intend to provide evidence to develop a program, so that's moving from one state to another or changing considerably. Or it might be to look at improvement, so if you've got a fixed intervention that isn't performing very well, you might need particular evidence to look at improving the outcomes. Quite often evaluations are to do with accountability, so reporting to boards or funders. They can be used to identify best practice or to look at informing commissioning and sustainability. They can also be used for scaling up and spread to provide evidence for how to achieve spread. So to take scaling up as an example, the types of evidence you'd be looking for in this type of evaluation should be generalizable to a lot of different settings. It needs to look at both spread, so that's moving to different settings in different organizations and different geographical locations, and growth, which is getting bigger in one particular site. It needs to understand the core elements and the peripheral elements, so the key ingredients, certain elements that can be flexible and others that need to be fixed in order for the program to work. There are elements around program support that need to be considered, for instance step changes in the size of a program, so that a program that's being managed by 4 people, they're incorporating it into their everyday work activities for 4 sites. When you look at 104 sites, will require completely different support to support that program. You need to look at predicted changes in efficiency as the size and spread increases, and the fit with the wider context. So if you have a service that relies on specific referral rates, as the program spreads, are the referral rates going to grow in line with that? So how does it fit in the wider context? One of the reasons why theory-driven evaluation is particularly important in the case of scaling up and spread is to do with what's termed Rossis Iron Law of evaluation, in that evaluations that start off looking as if they're going to be promising in one setting, when they start moving to other settings, give less and less returns and fewer positive outcomes. And this is all to do with not really understanding the context that the intervention's working in, not being able to be flexible to design it for new contexts, and not really understanding what it is, what's the key ingredient that works. So it's very important as well to understand the boundaries in evaluation, so setting out the scope, what it is that you're going to be looking at. It's important to define those in terms of organisational boundaries, they could be geographical boundaries, they could be boundaries in terms of the time, and even the roles of people involved in the evaluation. And to understand how that's influenced by different types of organisational structures. For instance, in single disciplinary teams, the boundaries are going to be quite different to when you start working with transdisciplinary teams or interdisciplinary teams, where there are different skill mixes and you're looking at lots of different types of outcomes, and the networks that people are working in are potentially much broader. So in this next exercise, I'd like you to think about identifying boundaries around your evaluation. So using the example that you're thinking of, or the area that you're interested in, what are the key boundaries for the evaluation? And what, importantly, are the key features of these boundaries? So are they stable? Will they change over time? Will different stakeholders have different opinions about these boundaries? And how permeable are they? Will you need to go beyond them in order to answer specific questions within the evaluation? Okay, so this next section we're going to look at situation recognition, so understanding the specific complexities and understanding the context that you're working in. So we're going to look at why it's important to recognise the complex elements of an evaluation setting. We're going to do this by looking at what complexity looks like in practice. This was a study done by Tilley and colleagues in 2015, looking at burglary rates for houses that were fitted with alarms. And he found some quite surprising results. There were positive marginal effects in an earlier study from 1992 to 1996, but then in the time period 2008 to 2012, alarms showed negative marginal effects. That means that houses that had burglar alarms fitted actually were more likely to be burgled than ones that didn't in this later study. And so you set about looking at possible explanations. There's some possible explanations on the next slide, or you can pause here and try and think of some reasons yourself before we move on. So here are some possible explanations that Tilley and colleagues came up with to describe these unexpected findings. They said that there could be dodgy data, there could be respondent error, so people are not necessarily remembering very well, because this was a self-reported survey. There could be changes in the behaviour of police or offenders. The burglar alarms could actually be flags for good targets, so showing that people might be out and there might be valuables in the house. And possible dilution, so if everybody's got a burglar alarm, then they no longer provide those preventative elements. There could be some other explanations as well, but they concluded that it's premature to conclude that burglar alarms shouldn't be encouraged, but we need to know more about the context and the mechanisms. So this demonstrates that if you're doing a purely outcome-focused evaluation, you would probably say that burglar alarms shouldn't be encouraged, because people who have burglar alarms are more likely to be burgled. So it's very important to understand the complexities, understand the context and the mechanisms that are working within that context. In recent years, some key thinkers in evaluation theory have started to incorporate theories of complexity into their work. And here we see some work by Michael Quinn-Patton with his developmental evaluation approach, and by Ray Pawson with his realistic evaluation approach, or realist evaluation as it's currently termed. There's a link here to a video of Ray Pawson talking about the complexity elements in realist evaluation, which are volition, that's the choice architecture within a program, so it's the decisions that people can and can't make within that program. It's concerned with the implementation, understanding the implementation chains, so what needs to happen first before other things happen, and how they lead to specific outcomes. Very interested, realist evaluation is very interested in the context. This is the key thing that defines whether the activities are achieving the outcomes that are intended. Time is also important, so what's happened before the program, what's going to happen during it, how long it's going for, and so on. Outcomes are very important, and these might be contested a lot of the time by some of the stakeholders in terms of priorities and importance. There's often a lot of rivalry in that the sorts of complex programs we're thinking about don't happen in a closed environment. It's a very open system that they work in, and there are other competing and rival programs and interventions happening within the environment. And emergence. So this is unexpected elements that are going to come out of a program that can't be predicted. And Michael Quinn-Patton, in his approach to evaluation in complex settings, uses theories drawn from chaos theory and complexity theory to understand the complexity of the situation. Okay, so here's a short exercise. I'd like you to think about what sort of things contribute to complexity in public health interventions by identifying complexity issues in the setting that you're thinking of. Here are some of the common complexities that are found in public health interventions. Quite often they are working in open systems, so that there are influences coming into the program from outside, and they're operating outside of the program envelope as well. They rely on changes within structures and changes in behaviour of actors, and this way they're quite co-evolutionary in that the structures will change people's actions and people's actions will feed back and change the structures. They rely on behaviour change of individuals, that's recipients of an intervention, and also staff who are trying to implement the intervention quite often, and these are happening in very complex environments. They are quite often emergent and adaptive as they learn and grow and develop in setting. They're quite often as well looking at very long-term effects, so it's difficult to understand how well you're doing in the short term. And they involve multiple stakeholders and have multiple incentives and multiple disincentives for those stakeholders. So I'd like to introduce you to some approaches that can aid your theory development when you're trying to develop a theory-driven evaluation approach. And these are logic models, theories of change, and realist evaluation approaches using context, mechanism, and outcome conjectures. So the first of these logic models, they are quite simple diagrammatical representations quite often of a program. They're sometimes flowcharts or sets of linked statements. They start off quite often with clearly defined goals and look at the program activities that are intended to achieve those goals. So they're quite often developed from the activities and intended outcomes, and they're very early attempts to match those activities with the outcomes. So here's an example of a fairly basic logic model. So we see the program is at-risk youths being mentored by adult volunteers. We see there's two proximal effects that are expected. The youths might model their mentor's behaviour, or they might use their leisure time more constructively. This is intended to result in reduced contact with antisocial peers and then ending up in decreased troublesome behaviour. And here's another potential logic model design where it's just columns with headings used to link statements. So for this exercise, I'd like you to develop a basic logic model for the evaluation or the intervention that you're thinking of. So you could include these headings, inputs, activities, outputs, the intermediate outcomes, and more long-term outcomes. So theories of change work on similar principles, but they're focused more on complex situations and understanding the complexity of the situation. These are causal models that try to describe the underlying assumptions of a program. They try to capture how and why desired changes are expected. Now, there's some clear differences between logic models and theories of change. Whereas logic models just identify the program components, theories of change identify and describe the complex relationships between the program components. Logic models are fairly simple demonstrations of how inputs, activities, and outcomes might be expected to join together, Whereas theories of change provide hypotheses about causality. They talk about why one thing should lead to another and demonstrate the extent to which a condition needs to be met in order to achieve or affect a specific change. So in summary, logic models are simplistic, they're representative and descriptive, and they can be quite useful ways to get fairly complex programs across to people to understand what the elements are. Theories of change, on the other hand, are more complex, they're more critical and more explanatory, and can be used as a really effective tool to start to understand your intervention or your program and to develop an evaluation that fits it. The third approach to theory-driven evaluation I'd like to introduce is realist evaluation theory. This relies on understanding the context, the mechanisms and the outcomes of an intervention to understand what works for whom, under what circumstances and why. To show how realist evaluation works, I'd like to give you an example of some work around car park closed circuit TV in order to try and reduce crime in car parks. So to understand the context here, we need to look at the number of offenders potentially in the area, the usage patterns of the car park, where the cameras are placed, are there any alternative targets, for instance, what are the supporting resources around the introduction of the cameras, because the cameras on their own might not have too much of an effect, and what's the cultural context, what's the reputation of CCTV, for instance. So these are some of the contextual elements that can actually work within the implementation to alter the outcomes. People see the cameras, they might think that there's a potential for crime, so they'll lock their doors, remove the valuables, etc., be more careful. And on the other hand, a car park that has cameras might appeal more to the cautious, so these would be the people who would necessarily be more careful, hide their possessions, make sure their car's locked, and so on. So there are various different mechanisms that the introduction of the cameras could have in reducing crime in that particular car park. So the key thing about theory-driven evaluation is to look at outcome patterns, and the evidence that you're collecting around the evaluation needs to be disaggregated, it needs to be granular enough to be able to look at the patterns and outcomes, not just whether something worked or it didn't. So we have here a couple of outcome patterns. So in car park number 1, overall thefts are considerably down, but there's a row of 5 cars that are regularly targeted. Now if you're looking at this as an outcome evaluation, you'd say that the introduction of the cameras has reduced the level of crime to an acceptable level, and it's been a success. Whereas if you understand the context and you're understanding the mechanisms of how the implementation is supposed to work, then you can start to understand that perhaps this row of 5 parking spaces aren't covered by the cameras. The people who are burgling from the cars know that the cameras don't cover these cars, and so crime carries on in this specific location. And unless you have the granularity of data to understand which cars are being targeted, then you might miss this particular feature and not be able to improve to a higher level of security. In car park number 2, on the other hand, thefts continue at a slightly reduced rate. Despite being in full view of the cameras, when these crimes are committed, no one's caught in the act or later apprehended. So you see that here we can understand that there's some breakdown in the linkage between the cameras and the response services. Now it's also very important to understand usefulness of an evaluation. How's it going to be used? Who's it going to be used by? So I'd like to think about this particular example and think who might be the stakeholders for the evaluation and what might they want to know. Okay, so I'd like to move on now to try and develop the program theory from something that is merely descriptive to something that understands the assumptions behind the model. So you should already have thought about a logic model and what that might look like, what the key elements might be. I'd like you to look at that now and think, what's the logic of the intervention? How would you explain how it works? And what are the underlying assumptions that the activities that are being implemented will result in specific outcomes? And what are the important contextual features that might influence those outcomes. It's useful very much to consider, if you draw a flowchart like the earlier example with the arrows between the boxes, it's what's behind the arrows that's most important. So it's how those linkages work and what are the assumptions underlying them. An important element of understanding the assumptions behind your theory model is to look at and understand behavior change mechanisms that you're assuming will happen in order to achieve the outcomes. So for this exercise, I'd like you to think about what mechanisms are important for the success of the intervention you're interested in evaluating, and how might you refine and test your theories about these. So as was demonstrated with the car park example, it's very important to decide on your outcomes and how to measure them. Quite often with complex settings, the outcomes can be unexpected, so it's useful to look at a wide range of outcomes and think about how you might disaggregate the data in order to explore further emerging theories. There's unlikely to be just one appropriate measure, so it's important to think of what measures actually fit the intervention. You need to consider the purpose and the focus of the evaluation and who wants to know what. Outcomes need to be practical, so you need to think about what resources you have, are the data that you need available, and so on. And it's useful to think of them in SMART terminology, so are the outcomes specific, measurable, are they attainable, relevant, and are they time bound? So another short exercise, I'd like you to revisit the logic model or your developing theory of change and decide on some measurement tools for your outcome. This is the final of the 3 principles. So we're going to be looking at stakeholder engagement and dissemination and usefulness. There are many reasons for engaging stakeholders quite closely in an evaluation. They can be critical for theory development and testing, so understanding from people on the ground who know the situation best. They can be useful for data collection in order to give you access to understand the data, understand what data is available. They can help to monitor the context as well. So with a complex intervention, a complex program, the context is quite often changing rapidly, and it's useful as an evaluator to know what changes are happening within the context. They can help to focus your evaluation outputs. So what do you need to produce? What's going to be useful for whom, at what time, and in what format? And they can be critical for ensuring the usefulness of the evaluation. So here's a short exercise you can do to identify your stakeholders and understand why you're engaging with your stakeholders. So I want you to revisit what the purpose of your evaluation will be. So go back to those early slides where we're looking at the purposes and reasons for evaluations. Then I want you to identify the key stakeholders and understand why they're important, to think about how and when you should engage with them, what you expect from them, and what they will expect from the evaluation. And it's useful here to look at Michael Patton's work on utilization-focused evaluation, and online there's a utilization-focused evaluation checklist which describes various stages and reasons for engaging with stakeholders. And finally, it's important to understand that evaluations are always constrained by practical concerns and practical elements that you're working within. So you need to understand the feasibility, how to allocate scarce resources, the usefulness of potential findings, and there's quite often findings that you can get from an evaluation that might not be able to be implemented, so recommendations that are not able to be put into place. So you need to consider about the usefulness of the potential findings. The evaluator's skill and expertise is important. The timing, so what's the usefulness in terms of when you should deliver findings, and what's the data availability. What access and permissions do you need? What are the ethics and governance issues? And commissioners' views are always very important in terms of defining the constraints around an evaluation. Conducting an evaluability assessment will help to identify these practical issues. Okay, so finally, to reflect on the talk We've looked at exercises to understand the stage, the focus, the scope and the end purpose of your evaluation. We've started to identify complex elements. We've started to develop a basic logic model and then developing that further into a theory of change or maybe into some context mechanism outcome conjectures. We've identified some of the key mechanisms for change, some of the behaviour change that's expected. Begun to select some potential outcome measures to look at. We've started to describe stakeholder engagement and how that might be used within the evaluation, and considered as well some practical concerns. So this has started to get together a framework, a firm framework on which to further develop your evaluation proposal. It might be useful at this stage to identify something that you may have learned, something you want to follow up or do differently, or something you want to know more about, and think about any actions you intend to take. There are some other resources available. The Better Evaluation website is a really good starting point for different approaches to evaluation. And the Evaluation What to Consider book published by the Health Foundation is also available online, and that's got further resources at the back of that. There are also some courses at the University of Sheffield that we can take as continuing professional development modules, short courses that are run, and also advice for evaluation consultancy. So thank you very much, and goodbye.